Okay, and welcome back to our second revision video for Paper 1 Migration. This time we'll be focusing on the early modern period, which runs from 1500 to 1700, and we're talking about therefore the 16th and 17th centuries. This is the period where we have the Tudors and also the English Civil War under Oliver Cromwell, so quite a major period in British history. And we have this time 7 migrant groups that we associate with this period. So the essential context to understand for this period is that during the 1500s, England is ruled by the Tudor dynasty. You know all about this from your Elizabeth paper. During the Tudor period, the Reformation took place, which is when the Christian church, which had been before predominantly Catholic, splits between Catholic and this new religion, Protestant. And England eventually, under Henry VIII, and then more so under Elizabeth, becomes a Protestant country. Again, you know all about that from your Elizabeth paper, when Elizabeth passes the religious settlement with the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity and the Royal Injunctions. That solidifies England as a Protestant country, making it a safe place for Protestant migrants to come to. In the 1600s, the kind of second part of the early modern period, there is a civil war between supporters of the king and supporters of Parliament. Parliament win that civil war and the king, King Charles I, is executed. This means England is ruled by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector instead of the king. So it's kind of the only time in English history where there is no king in charge. So it's a slight change from what we've seen before because it's less important what the monarch thinks about migration and more important what the government and Parliament thinks about migration. They do bring back the monarchy, and monarchs are very involved in supporting, the Huguenots and the Palatines at first, but we see Parliament remaining much more powerful from then on. So, as stated, one of the really key changes in this period is the Reformation, and there are 3 migrant groups that we associate with England being a Protestant country. We have the Walloons, or the Dutch, who come from the Netherlands. We have the Huguenots, who come from France. And we have the Palatines, who come from Germany. Now, all 3 of these groups are Protestants living in countries ruled by Catholics. So a big part of the reason why they migrate is to escape religious persecution and come to England, which is a safe haven for Protestants. So we're going to get into the more specific reasons why each of these 3 groups come. Obviously, religious persecution is the main one, but there are other pull factors as well, predominantly economic opportunity, so the fact that they're going to be able to find work in England, and the fact that with all 3 groups there's some form of invitation or encouragement by the government who want them to come to England. So the spend details that we need to know: in the Netherlands, they're controlled by Catholic Spain, and the Spanish Duke of Alba has been attacking, torturing, killing Protestants. Again, that is covered in the Elizabeth course. That is the Dutch revolt causing migration to England. For the Huguenots, French Catholics had been attacked by Protestants at the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and in one weekend, 10,000 Protestants in Paris are killed, which leads to the first wave of Protestant migration in the 1570s from France. Later on, in the 1680s, France actually completely bans being Protestant, so you get a second wave of Huguenot migration, and as we'll see, they become a really significant migrant group. Finally, the Palatines. They're from Germany, but the part of Germany they're from is called the Rhineland-Palatinate. That's where they get the name Palatines. And this was under the control of Catholics at the time, and Protestants were being attacked and discriminated against. But it isn't simply religious persecution acting as a push factor. There are other pull factors too. So for the Walloons, they are weavers and textile workers, and because England already has a strong wool and cloth trade, they have skills in these areas. They know they're going to be able to find jobs in England. For the Huguenots, very similar thing. They are very, very talented textile producers, but producing these kind of higher quality goods, silk, brocade. So again, they know there's going to be work opportunities for them in England. For the Palatines, it's less so much a pull factor as a push factor. In Germany, there's been very poor harvests. Because the majority of Palatines are farmers, this means there's no jobs for them in Germany, so they're going to come to England to see if they can get better opportunities. Finally, in all three cases, there's an element to which they are invited by the government. For the Walloons, they are asked and invited to move to two towns, which are our case studies for this period, Sandwich and Canterbury, because those towns are in economic decline, they don't have enough people, they don't have enough workers, so they're actually invited to move there and fill up the empty houses. For the Huguenots, there's really strong support from the monarchy to bring the Huguenots over. King Charles II offers them denizen status, which is basically equal rights to English people, even though they're foreigners. William and Mary in the 1680s offer Huguenots royal protection if they move to England. So again, that's another pull factor. For the Palatines, this new law has been passed, the Foreign Protestant Naturalisation Act, and that law, the clue is in the name, promises any foreign Protestants who move to England that they can be naturalised. That means become kind of full citizens with rights. So it's a pull factor for them to move to England because they will actually have rights and freedoms once they get there. So the experience of the three groups is a little bit varied. For the Walloons, we see that they have a positive experience, especially in Sandwich and Canterbury. For the Huguenots, again, they have a very positive experience, but it's a slightly different story for the Palatines, who have quite a negative experience once they move to England. So for the Walloons, the positive experience is mainly economic success. They have a lot of job opportunities, and some of the Walloons become wealthy, set up successful businesses. We also see that attitudes towards them are quite positive. They are accepted, they are welcomed, and they become part of the community, especially in Sandwich and Canterbury, as we'll see in our case study in a minute. We also see they have religious freedom, which tends to be a big sign of successful migration. The fact that they're able to build their own churches where they can have church services like performed in Dutch so they understand them shows again that acceptance and that welcome and that positive experience. Very similar story for the Huguenots, but perhaps on an even bigger scale. They have huge economic success, particularly in Soho and Spitalfields, where they set up lots of silk weaving businesses. Again, they are accepted and welcomed with a lot of support from the monarch and the government. And again, they have religious freedom, they're able to have their own churches. For the Palatines, however, because they don't really have any skills they're bringing to England, they are farmers, and England already has plenty of farmers. It's very difficult for them to find jobs, so they have economic failure compared to the economic success of the Walloons and the Huguenots. Because they can't find jobs, very hard for them to find good places to live, so they end up living on a refugee camp on Blackheath Common. And actually many of them simply end up getting deported. 3,000 are deported to Ireland, some are sent to America, some are simply sent back to Germany. So their experience, because they can't contribute in the same way as the others, is very, very negative. So we're going to start with our first case study, which is Sandwich and Canterbury, and this is to do with Walloon and Dutch migration. The first kind of impact these groups have, and the most obvious one, is the economic improvement. The Dutch are master weavers, very, very highly skilled workers who make high quality goods, and they bring these new products, broadcloth, silk, to England, and they're very popular, so they sell really well. We can see their economic success in Sandwich. They have the markets twice a week. In Canterbury, they actually have their own weavers' hall and market, which you can see in the picture. and they bring new trades to Canterbury like silk dyeing and diamond cutting. Because nobody else has these skills, there's very little competition, so their businesses are economically successful. We can see that economic success through the fact they're rich enough to build their own homes, and we can see the Dutch architecture in these homes even up to today, things like gables, for example. We see Walloons bringing new crops and new food, so celery is brought by the Walloons, and so is carrots, which are obviously going to change what people eat. In terms of religious impact, we see in both cases they are given spaces to worship and churches that they can use. So for example, in Sandwich, they were given St. Peter's Church. So again, showing that positive experience, showing that acceptance, that they're being allowed to practice their religion freely. So largely, it does seem like a picture of acceptance, and we see this in the fact they take part in the celebrations when Queen Elizabeth visits Sandwich. They work with the rest of the town to prepare defences when they think the Spanish Armada is going to invade them. And we see the Walloon elders, these like old people from the Walloon community who are kind of in charge, working really closely with the city authorities to keep order and stop crime and keep everyone safe. However, it's not an entirely perfect picture. We do see, as we've seen with lots of other migrant groups, signs of resentment and jealousy when they get economically successful. So in Sandwich, for example, they tried to put these rules in place to limit what jobs the Walloons can do, to try and stop them competing with any local Englishmen. But largely, it is still very much a positive picture. Very similar situation in Soho and Spitalfields in London, which is where lots of the Huguenots moved to. Again, there seems to be lots of support for them. They're religious refugees, so some of them come to the country with like no money, no property, and there's actually fundraising led by the King and Queen to get money to help them settle in, and that raises over 3 million to help the new Huguenots' arrivals. So immediately we see that help and support that they are getting. That's William, that's Mary. Much like in Sandwich and Canterbury, huge economic improvement. They also were highly skilled workers, especially in making silk, and we can see the massive impact they have because there is a 20 times increase, not 20%, 20 times increase in silk production, most of which is coming from Spitalfields. They're allowed to join the Weavers' Company, which was a respected guild that would basically be like a higher status for your business if you can be in a guild, so it helps them economically. And we see individual examples of massive success. So James Lehman was a silk maker who became hugely successful. You can see some examples of the kind of beautiful silk patterns he created there. And the economic success of the Huguenots is shown by the really large houses that they are able to build in Spitalfields, many of which still stand there today. Again, similar to the Walloons, they are allowed to build their own churches. The first Huguenot church built in London is called the Church of Strangers, but we see 9 new churches built in Spitalfields, and these churches are really important in helping them kind of protect their French culture, build communities, and also really gain acceptance. So again, Soho and Spitalfields, much like Sandwich and Canterbury, really strong example of both a positive experience and a positive impact. So looking at the wider impact of these groups outside of the case studies, both the Walloons and the Huguenots have really significant impact that is positively benefiting the country in a variety of areas, mainly economic, but also social and a bit political. Slightly different for the Palatines, they only have a very minor impact. Because they can't find work, because they live in a refugee camp, because they don't live in the country very long, because they are deported, that impact is pretty limited. But we do see big impact from the Walloons and from Dutch migrants. So politically, there isn't really much to say, but economically, the impact is really significant. They develop the towns of Sandwich and Canterbury with all the new trades they bring. We see specific examples like Cornelius Vermuyden, who is a Dutch engineer who drains the fens. The fens is an area in East England that was like swamp and marshland, which means you can't really farm, you can't really live there and make a living. So when he drains the fens, that has a really positive economic impact on the area. So we see positive impact on Sandwich and Canterbury because they save both towns from economic ruin. Positive impact on the fens because once they're able to use it as farmland, because he's literally drained the water out of it, it makes the area a place people can live. And my class will know, being from Cambridge, which is near the fens, I personally am very grateful to Cornelius Vermuyden for his work. It's not just economic impact though, we do see some kind of social and cultural impact. There are new crops that are formed like celery and carrots, and the Dutch masters have a real strong cultural impact. These were Dutch painters who were living in England like Anthony van Dyck, and also as said they have their own churches. That's Anthony van Dyck there in a self-portrait, and these are the kind of paintings that he would do, these very lustrous royal portraits. And these obviously impact England quite a lot. New food for people's diets as a result of the new crops. These Dutch masters become very, very famous painters, and that influences art styles in Britain and across the world. And by building their own churches, it actually really encourages improved attitudes towards migration, a lot more religious tolerance, and it really strengthens England's identity as a Protestant country. If you think about how they've only just become Protestant quite recently, and that's something a lot of the Catholics are not happy with. So by bringing more Protestants to the country, building more Protestant churches, that's strengthening England's Protestant identity. For the Huguenots, similar impact but even bigger. We'll start with economic because that's still definitely the main area they have influence. They obviously develop Soho and Spitalfields, they increase silk production, but they're also really involved in the steel industry, in the paper industry. And one thing that a lot of my students forget about, but is actually really important, is they helped to set up the Bank of England. So 10% of the money used to set up the bank came from Huguenots. The first governor of the Bank of England was from a Huguenot family. So those are all quite significant impacts. Obviously, that then brings huge economic benefit and really strengthens England's economy and banking system. Like the Walloons, we also see religious and social and cultural impact when they build the churches, like the Church of Strangers. That really, again, encourages religious tolerance and strengthens England's Protestant identity because you have even more Protestant people arriving in the country to kind of start to outnumber the Catholics a little bit more. Politically, there is impact from the Huguenots. We see the Foreign Protestant Naturalisation Act is a law that is passed by Parliament in response to Huguenot migration. Because they've been so successful, they want to encourage similar migrants to come, so they pass this law, and then that obviously leads to further migration, like the Palatine migration, although obviously that does backfire a little bit. So moving on to other groups that are not the Protestant refugees from this period. Very popular with my class, the Black Tudors. Now when it comes to the causes, they're pretty varied. There's not really one or two causes that we can pin down brought the Black Tudors to England. Similarly with impact, because they do lots of different jobs, they do lots of different things, their impact is quite varied. There's not one particular industry or area that they really change. So what we can focus on for Black Tudors is their experience, and what's important about this experience is it's largely positive. So the evidence shows that they're not really being treated differently or discriminated against or being treated in a racist way. The evidence actually suggests that they are treated and judged much the same way as any other people in England. They might be judged by what job they did or how much money they had, but not really by the colour of their skin. And also, key thing to remember for Black Tudors is that they are not enslaved, and they couldn't be enslaved because even though the slave trade is developing around the world and in other countries, slavery is not actually legal within England, and that's pretty much always been the case. So you can see with all the examples of Black Tudors we looked at, really quite strong examples of how they are being treated like anybody else. Whether that's Jacques Francis the diver, he gave evidence as a witness in court, and that evidence was still taken seriously. Mingo was the servant who inherited a lighthouse, so he becomes, a rich property owner. We see Mary Phyllis, who was a servant and a basket maker. She converts to Christianity, so again showing that acceptance that she was able to join the Christian religion, which would be like the mainstream religion in England at this time. Again, Catalina, the independent single lady with a cow, she seems to have made her living by selling her cow's milk and doing small jobs, but doesn't seem to have been negatively affected by having been black. Reasonable Black Man, again a successful business owner, possibly called that because of his reasonable prices. And finally, everybody's favourite, John Blanc, the black trumpeter, the court musician who worked in the court of the king, King Henry VII, King Henry VIII. And we see that he was given a pay rise when he asked for one. He was given a wedding gift from the king. I think he was given a hat and a cloak. So all of these examples really show these people are just kind of living ordinary lives and are not discriminated against for being black in the way that we see people being discriminated against in the industrial and even the modern periods in a far, far worse way. So one group that definitely does experience negative treatment is the Gypsies, as they would be referred to at the time, because they thought they were from Little Egypt. When it comes to the causes, again, there isn't loads to say. It is a travelling culture where it's expected that you're moving around pretty constantly. So in part of that movement, some of them would come to England. And again, their impact is very minor because they're moving around a lot, because they're kind of doing odd jobs or low paid labour work. They aren't really massively changing the country. Again, what's important about them is their experience, which is very, very negative due to attacks from the government. So quite similar to how we see Jews being treated in the medieval period. So the key examples to know about are the 1530 Egyptians Act, where Henry VIII orders all gypsies to leave the country, very similar to the Edict of Expulsion in the medieval period. And then slightly later on, under Queen Mary, we see being a gypsy and having that travelling culture is made punishable by death, and we do see several examples of people being hanged and executed for being gypsies. So that experience is very, very negative. Lascars and Ayers, slightly more to say. We can break it down into cause, experience, and impact. The cause of their migration is largely economic and to do with trade and the creation of this new company, the East India Company, created with Queen Elizabeth's permission in 1600, and that brings Lascars, so male Indians who work as sailors on East India Company trading ships that are going between India and England, and the Ayers who work as nannies or as servants or maids for English East India Company workers. They live with the families, look after the children, and come to England with them as part of the EIC. Their experience, pretty negative. They are often abandoned by the ships that they are working on or abandoned by the families that they are working for, and it's very difficult for them to find work or a place to live. They tended to live in port cities because these cities on the coast that ships are arriving to would be kind of a natural place for them to be living. So places like London, Liverpool, also Glasgow, Cardiff. But we do see many of them who are abandoned, just basically homeless and living in poverty, so having that very negative experience. Because of that, the impact is again quite minor. Obviously, they're contributing economically by working for the EIC, but for those who are abandoned in England, it tends to be low-skilled labour jobs and living in poverty, which means that they're not really having a big effect changing the country in the way that, like, the Huguenots, for example, are changing the country with the silk industry and the Bank of England. Okay, the final group to look at for this period is readmitted Jews, and we've kind of worked through this chronologically. Lots of those previous migrants were migrating in the kind of Tudor period, whereas the readmitted Jews, they come in the 1600s when they're invited by Oliver Cromwell because of their economic benefits. Their experience is quite mixed, as we will see. It does definitely better in some ways than the medieval period, but definitely still they experience discrimination and anti-Semitism, and their impact nonetheless is quite major despite the challenges and discrimination they face. So when it comes to why they come to the country, obviously Jews had been expelled from England. They'd not been allowed to be there since 1290, so it's been about 400 years since they were allowed to even be in England. Oliver Cromwell takes over as Lord Protector following the English Civil War, and he's not a king, so he's able to basically just cancel the Edict of Expulsion and say, well, a king passed that law and we don't have kings anymore, so you can just cancel it, and in doing so allow Jews back to the country. And his motivation for this is largely the economic benefits that they will bring to banking and finance. There is some evidence that he's religiously motivated and he wants to convert them to Christianity, but realistically it was probably the economic benefits he was looking for. So when it comes to their experience, as I said, quite mixed. Looking at the positives, they build synagogues like the Bevis Mark Synagogue in London, which still stands today, which is a really clear sign of their religious freedom. They are working in a variety of jobs, which is usually a real sign of acceptance. They're not just allowed to do one thing, they're allowed to do lots of different jobs: bankers, butchers, doctors, businessmen, rabbis, and many other professions. And we do see some individual examples of really big economic success. The Mendes da Costa family becomes incredibly wealthy. Moses Hart, who you can see in the picture on the right, becomes very wealthy, and through that has an economic and political impact, as we will see. But on the negative side, anti-Semitic attitudes definitely still existed. We see popular culture at the time, like songs and plays and poems, really showing negative stereotypes of Jews. So for example, one of Shakespeare's plays, The Merchant of Venice, includes this character that really plays into negative stereotypes of Jews being very greedy and very sneaky. So it was actually kind of promoting those negative values. And there's actually laws discriminating against Jews at this time. So if you were Jewish, you couldn't be a member of parliament. If you were Jewish, you couldn't join the army. If you were Jewish, you weren't allowed to be a lawyer. So lots of these quite important roles in society they are not allowed to do, showing those anti-Semitic attitudes still exist and will continue to exist until the industrial period. Even with this discrimination, their impact is quite major. So major economic impact in terms of developing banking, trade and business. For example, Moses Hart, who we mentioned earlier, made a fortune trading on the Royal Exchange. And then through making this money, they have a political impact because they use money to fund monarchs, to fund politicians, and to fund wars that England is fighting at this time. So that is all of the groups. I'm just going to quickly draw out some themes because themes are really useful to think about for 12 and 16 mark questions. When it comes to causes, I would say there's three kind of main causes that stand out. Religion, where we see Walloons, Huguenots and Palatines all coming for religious reasons. They are all Protestants escaping Catholic persecution. A second one that we always see in every time period is trade and work and economic benefits. We see the Protestant migrants coming for this reason as well, but we also see other migrants, as we'll see in a minute. Invitation and encouragement from the government is another theme. Again, we can pull the Protestant migrants in this category. As we've seen, they were supported by the government, supported by the King and Queen. Other migrant groups that fit into these categories, we do see the Lascars obviously coming as part of trade in the East India Company, and we see readmitted Jews being encouraged to come by Oliver Cromwell. You'll notice that Black Tudors aren't really on here because there's not really one cause of their migration that we can pick out. Same for Gypsies, there's not really a cause of migration that we can discuss and compare with other migrant groups. When it comes to the experience, it's always best to just think, is it positive, is it negative, or is it a mixture of the two? In the early modern period, we actually do see some positive migrant experiences, which are actually quite rare in this course. Walloons are accepted in Sandwich and Canterbury. Huguenots have economic success and a lot of welcome and support. Black Tudors, as we've seen, don't seem to experience discrimination or racism and live fairly successful lives. The mixed example for this period, I would say, is the readmitted Jews. As we said, there's really significant economic success, there is religious freedom, but there's also anti-Semitism and discrimination in the laws that ban them from doing certain things like being an MP. But there are very clear negative examples as well. The Palatines live in a refugee camp, they can't find work, and they're deported by the government, so there's not really any support for them. Lascars and Ayers, once they are abandoned, are living in poverty. And for the Gypsies, perhaps the worst experience because they are kicked out of the country, they are punished literally for being Gypsies, and we see examples of execution and violence against them. Finally, when it comes to impact, always useful to think of it in terms of political, economic, and social, and many of the groups that we've looked at do fit into multiple categories. We do see economic impact for the Walloons mainly, but there is some social impact through the churches and the celery. For the Huguenots, political impact in the laws, but definitely major economic impact and that social impact of their churches and religion. Black Tudors are obviously having that economic impact through the different jobs that they work, although again there's not really one key area or job that they make a massive contribution to. Lascars and Ayers are making that economic contribution through working for the East India Company, and the readmitted Jews are contributing to the banking and finance system. It's why they are encouraged to come by Cromwell. They also are having, though, that political impact by using their money to fund monarchs and fund wars. Again, you'll notice some groups not included on here, the Palatines, the Gypsies, just don't really have any impact at all. So, if you've just watched this video and you want to put all that information to good use, you can work your way through some of these practice questions. Because migration is a fairly new GCSE paper, there's not a lot of past papers out there, there's only kind of 2 or 3, so trying these practice questions that the history department has made for you is a really good way to practice putting your knowledge to good use.